Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Jennifer Clinton, and I want to welcome you to the new Vistas Dialogues Series. Wonderful to have you with us today, and I know many are joining from different time zones. I'm joining from Washington, D.C., and I know it's lunchtime here, so feel free to have a bite. I know people are joining from Germany, so it's a little early for dinner, but do what you need to do. It's great to have you with us. This is a second in a series of discussions that Cultural Vistas has held over the last several months on relevant topics that convene our Cultural Vistas community that's made up of corporate partners, higher education institutions, foundations, supporters, and alumni. These discussions look to bring together diverse perspectives across a critical topic to inspire global collaboration on important issues facing our world. Our goal with these discussions is to mobilize our broad network to share knowledge, raise curiosity, and build a community of global leaders. Our first discussion in the series took place back in August, and it was on global mobility. Today's discussion will focus on digital health and artificial intelligence. The next one, scheduled for January with a date to be determined, will be on sustainable food systems. So I know today's topic is top of mind for all of us. We're paying very close attention to it and also have had personal experiences with digital health and artificial intelligence over the last several months. So today we're joined by three prominent members of our community. First is our board member, Rekha Grennan, who represents, who I'll introduce formally in a moment. Second is a representative from one of our host companies, Tommaso Mansi from Siemens Healthineers. And a third is a representative from our alumni community from Bayer Pharmaceuticals, Dominick and Henderson. So you will have the opportunity to ask questions and share your perspectives throughout the course of today's session. But I did want to start by first thanking our panelists for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedules to be with this community. And I wanted to start by introducing our moderator, Rekha Grennan. A little bit of background on Rekha. In addition to serving on our board of directors, Rekha has held significant leadership positions in the private and public sectors, particularly in the healthcare field, working for Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. And during her time at Pfizer, she managed a $1 billion global disease elimination partnership with the World Health Organization, as well as the Global Health Fellows Program. Rekha, thanks so much for leading our discussion today. And Rekha will formally introduce our special guests. So thanks all for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer. This is a lot of fun and a real honor, and I hope that we have a pretty free-flowing conversation today. One thing I'll say as a new board member of Cultural Vistas, I'm continually amazed by the breadth and depth of the research and expertise, the reach and expertise of our global community. It's incredibly expansive and I think today is a really great example of the level of expertise that Cultural Vistas can call upon. And as Jennifer mentioned, we're going to be talking about digital tools and digital health today, as well as AI and its impact on health. But, and I think a topic that is very front and center in everyone's minds, particularly over the last 11 months or so. And as we move forward with lots of new innovations coming up the pike in so rapidly changing world, there is nothing that will spark change and innovation like a crisis. I think we can all relate to that at this time. So I'd like to talk about a little bit about Dominick Henderson first. We have two experts here today, but I'm going to introduce them one by one, and then hopefully we can have a little bit of a dialogue. But Dominick recently joined Bayer's G4A team, and following successful stints in Bayer's global functions for public affairs and communications, respectively. As a Washington, D.C. native, Dominick developed his earlier career experiences in lab research, hospitals, digital health startups, healthcare investment banking. So he's covered the full spectrum of all of the stakeholder players in these broader collaborations. He stepped into the international healthcare stage as a Robert Bosch Foundation Fellow in 2010, and as a global head of Bayer's G4A from 2020. So this is a relatively new position. There we go with the logo. Dominick supports one of the industry's leading platforms for digital health startup partnership to change the experience of health, to put people at the center of managing their health in the digital age. That is quite a vision. and one that we all hope comes to fruition quite soon. So Dominic, thank you for joining us today. Could you please, maybe start with a little bit about your experience as a Robert Bosch Fellow and some of the insights that brought to mind and how it plays into your experience and how it shapes your work at Bayer?
Right. The Robert Bosch Fellowship Program, it's phenomenal because it's the kind of program that really introduces you to every mechanism of society or every mechanism that controls society, essentially. So through the program, essentially what you do is you're exposed to policy, business, media, culture, and not only are you exposed to all of those different areas and kind of those different verticals, if you will, but you're also kind of put in a position where you contrast all of that information. So as a fellow, the way the fellowship program was designed 10 years ago, we had to do like a public stage and we had to do a private stage. And in between our stage periods, we had these really intensive kind of seminars. And these seminar kind of sessions, especially, were definitely developed to challenge you, to encourage you to look at different ways to think. So in a day, we would go to, 2 or 3 different kind of media outlets and look at, how these media outlets program. We would meet with not programmatic people, but really like the CEO. We would do the same with big companies. We would do the same with NGOs. And I think by the time, by the end of the program, you definitely have a very large awareness of the world, and not really just the world, but the way the world functions. And so once you're kind of outside of the program and once you're no longer a fellow, the way you're able to kind of conceptualize everything from policy, from NGOs, from partners to business, and what kind of makes those things work, you're really in a lot of ways at an advantage because you have a view that most people don't and that most people can't really conceptualize. And I think for me, that was really the biggest benefit. And especially as you kind of describe my background, you'll see it's here, it's there, and I've always liked that fluidity in my background, and I've liked being able to move around. And that's probably a testament to the Bosch program. So since Bosch, especially over the last 10 years, yeah, I've done healthcare investment banking. I work with startups now in our global accelerator and digital health partnership program with Bayer. And I've done the global policy and I've done global communications, and most of that is probably because of, being able to understand some of those mechanisms.
Yeah, it's an incredible experience, and you've certainly covered the full ecosystem, I think. But so can you talk a little bit about your work at Bayer and what we should be thinking about in the future and what really sparks your imagination at the moment?
Right. So I have to say, I didn't wear a suit, but I had to wear my G4A t-shirt.
Perfectly acceptable.
Right? In part, I'm wearing this actually because we had our biggest event of the year yesterday. So we're kind of riding a little bit of a high here in Berlin. And what we do, we actually have Europe's first biopharmaceutical accelerator at G4A. And G4A is actually a bit of an acronym. So it was formerly and originally known as Grants for Apps. It launched about 8 years ago. And it was really kind of a grassroots cultural exchange, if you will, to create transparency with the Berlin startup ecosystem and to bring a lot of that Berlin startup ecosystem right inside of Bayer, and to have kind of this very Newtonian organization learn how to be fluid and how to think in a more nimble way and adopt new technologies.
Yeah.
So what we do at G4A and at Bayer is we essentially look for digital health partners. So normally these can be small companies or these can be kind of larger companies. And we have 2 profiles. We have a growth kind of a profile and an advanced kind of profile. And with our growth companies, we make a kind of a seed investment, or what could be considered a seed investment of €100,000 into these companies. And essentially what we want to do there is create like a market validation pathway for digital health. And with our advanced companies, we are normally looking to commercialize some part of our business and really kind of scale that partnership.
Great. Just one sort of additional question I would ask there. I think especially those of us based in the United States, are quite familiar with the impact that the startup community has on the economy and innovation. Can you talk a little bit about what that community is like in Europe? I mean, it's a very different ecosystem. I spent some time in Berlin about 2014, actually, it's not too long ago, and met with a number of some very well-developed startups, but they weren't as, they felt that there was a lot of needs in the startup community in Berlin.
Absolutely. So, you know, G4A, we are a global program. And, you know, I started working on startups and in digital health, you know, 15 years ago. And initially, when I was introduced to the startup scene in Germany and in Europe, I was really kind of skeptical. Mostly because, well, there are a few kind of structural limitations, I think, well, cultural and structural.
Yeah.
So, you know, I was always a bit on the sales side in terms of culture, because you have very different incentives for working in a place like Germany, especially, and in a place like the United States. You know, and I think that work culture plays a big role in startups, and how a lot of people don't understand the kind of energy it takes to work at a startup, how many sleepless nights you have. You know, you can maybe see the bags under my eyes. We work for Bayer, but we work a lot like a startup at G4A.
Yeah.
You know, and part of what I mean is, you know, something actually I learned through the Bosch program. You know, when you go to these work culture has a very, very deep rooted tradition. I think even if you go back to World War II, you know, when you go to these concentration camps, you know, what do you see? You see this big kind of emblem over them, or these words that say, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. And, you know, so the concept of like putting in a lot of effort in work sometimes is just like not there, you know, and for good reason. You know, I think that work-life balance is a real thing in Europe. And I think that that's something that has to be respected, especially given the history of Europe over the last 100 years.
Yeah.
I think for the United States, and part of the structural limitation, you know, when it comes to kind of the venture ecosystem, again, kind of people in the venture capital space or in the private equity space, they have very different reasons for wanting to invest. In Germany or in France, you know, you normally have what are called family office structures for investing. You know, you don't normally have, or you can have a professional VC.
Yep.
But I think VCs in the US are much more advanced, probably. And I don't want to overstate that, but generally a bit more advanced or structured than what you would see in Europe, especially if you have a family office structure.
Right. Yeah, I think there's still, I mean, in some ways on that perspective, we still have a lot of runway in the US alone on how we look at VCs and investment opportunities, and also appropriately support startups.
Right.
But I'm going to switch a little bit so we can bring Tommaso into the discussion. He's our European representative today. But Tommaso is a PhD. He is currently serving as Senior Director of R&D in Image-Guided Therapy and Robotics at Siemens Healthineers in Princeton, New Jersey. His main areas of focus are on intelligence for image-guided interventions, computational physiology for patient-specific simulations, and medical robotics. That's a mouthful. There's a lot going on there. Dr. Mansi and his team successfully translated breakthrough innovations into multiple Siemens Healthineers, receiving several academic and industrial honors in the medical imaging field. And as appropriate for his field, Tommaso has several dozen patents with his name on them, as does his team, probably going up from there. But Tommaso, thank you for joining us today. And I understand that your team at Siemens Healthineers has included interns and trainees in partnership with Cultural Vistas. So I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about your work and where those interns and trainees have come into your program and perhaps help support you.
So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. So it's my pleasure to be here. Maybe let me introduce a bit Siemens Healthineers, so the company for whom I work. Actually, it's funny because it's a German company and I'm in the US from European background, and it's a big company. So it's interesting, the parallel with what Dominic just said just before. So what we do is we are one of the major equipment company, medical equipment company, and we develop systems, imaging systems like CT scanners, MRI, ultrasound, CAMs, robots, also lab tests. Basically, we develop equipment to help physicians better treat patients. So really what drives us is to develop technologies that help the patient life, and also to extend the reach of healthcare worldwide. Now, what I do within that mission, so I'm part of the technology center here in Princeton, New Jersey, and our mission really is more on the innovation side to develop new technologies based on AI, software, robotics, that would fuel the product of the future. And so digitalization is big on what we do every day, and the innovation is really core of our job. And as of that, so we have the chance and luxury to actually work with many interns and through Cultural Vistas. So this is really a very, very important role or position, or what we do every day is to basically be able to host the students at our place, offer them the life in a R&D big company environment for their learning in the United States, in the Princeton area, which is also pretty nice for students to learn also the American culture. And for us, it's also they bring an immense value, because they come with their own background, their own perspective, European perspective, Asian perspective, South America, everywhere from where we come. And this is extremely important for innovation. So you need to bring diversity in thinking to see the problem from different angles. And maybe one of the angles brings the innovation that you were not seeing from your perspective. So really, this collaboration with Cultural Vista and the interns that we have, and we will have, is really an important fuel of the innovation that we do.
That's great. I work primarily in the environmental social governance, corporate responsibility space, and the one thing we always talk about is quantifying the returns on investment, and diversity certainly has those returns there. Can you talk a little bit about, both of you, actually, Dominic and Tommaso, if you could both kind of talk a little bit about your work right now and the future of healthcare. I mean, COVID has brought to mind front and center for those of us kind of on the periphery of the arena, or even just in completely different industries. But healthcare's pretty much healthcare's come to mind very front and center for everyone globally. And depending on the structures of our healthcare systems, our levels of access, we now have much more awareness than we once did. There's a lot more discussion around AI, data privacy, but then also the tools and the accessibility. And I'd love if you could both talk about the intersections with your work.
Maybe Tommaso will want to start.
All right. So from our perspective, what COVID brought is an acceleration of what was already happening in digitalization of healthcare in particular. And actually, we have been somewhat constrained to digitalize some of the processes, right? But in a sense, we do see every day this transformation happening, accelerating, where you have technologies like AI. I can only speak from an imaging perspective. I don't know on the lab, but just my experience, right? So we see AI that brings a lot more of automation and standardization. So basically bring automation to make the devices easier to use, quantify what you see in the images, basically transform data into knowledge to support the decision, and improve eventually outcome. But not only that, if automation makes the devices easier to use, then it means that you can bring this device where the patients are, so closer to the communities worldwide. So basically bring healthcare to the patients. And so this is really a fundamental change, right, that is driving, and it's a very, very positive and optimistic change, right, where technology can actually expand basically high-end healthcare everywhere.
Great. Can you give us an example of a specific area where technology has kind of taken healthcare to the community level? And take your pick geographically. I know it means different things in different places.
I mean, it's difficult to pinpoint one specific example because then, but the trend is there. For instance, in terms of reading of images, right? Bringing automation in reading, such that all the, let's say, mundane task of contouring and is removed, such that then the radiologist can really focus on the patient, on the disease, right? On really what matters. And we see, and this is an example where now, thanks to the cloud, this technology becomes available beyond actually the big hospitals, for instance. The other example would be also telerobotics, right? Where, you know, you take very complicated procedures, right, that need to be done in a high-end hospital who has all the equipment and trained staff there. Now using a robot that is tele-manipulated, then you can actually envision setups where you have a robot in an antenna hospital, for instance, but the expert still in the main place, but tele-guiding the procedure, right? And so this is basically the directions and what the changes that are happening today.
Great.
Yeah, I would maybe jump off. My jump off point would be kind of what Tommaso was saying around high-end healthcare, because that kind of made me think about like a vertical value chain, if you could imagine that.
Yeah.
You know, so you have kind of healthcare systems at the top of that value chain, and then you have people, like actual people. I don't want to say at the bottom, but kind of, I guess, realizing the value of that value chain at the end. Like they're the end users, they're the ones actually accessing or using digital health, right? And so what that makes me think is that the one thing about healthcare that is true that we see now that will always be true is that all healthcare is local. You know, and it's local to the individual. The number one predictor of health and healthcare is your zip code. You know, it's how many fresh food markets you have in your neighborhood. It's whether you can exercise in your neighborhood, which for a lot of marginalized communities, you know, it can be difficult to do because that brings in safety issues, you know, which brings in, you know, the psychosocial aspects of healthcare, you know, and kind of these other kind of frameworks. And so what we're seeing is that people are now, one, they're aware of it because they're absolutely paying attention to who's in their zip code, who's around them, who's sitting next to them in a restaurant. Oh, that person just coughed. Oh my God, get me out of here, right?
Yeah.
And so like this level of awareness, you know, for our businesses, exactly like Tommaso said, there's an acceleration and a recognition and an awareness that we probably haven't had, you know, in living memories. So in the last 100 years, to be quite frank and quite honest. And I mean, like everyone right now on the planet is essentially like a novice kind of virologist, right? I mean, like the amount of information that we get every day on virology and vaccines and pathogens, it's like completely unprecedented. So kind of in the biopharmaceutical business, again, so we kind of have this vertical value chain. And I think in the healthcare system, you have very different value chains. You have a hospital value chain, you have kind of a Siemens value chain. For biopharmaceuticals, the way that we see technology shifting and kind of this AI point that you mentioned, there are very distinct places on the value chain. There's drug discovery, there's clinical development, we also look at kind of this aspect that Tommaso was describing around like clinical decision support. So when you talk about imaging, you know, like what does imaging and AI really mean? It means that if I have an image, that AI can find a cancer or a tumor or something faster than a doctor can with like 99.9% accuracy, right? Then we have pharmacovigilance in the biopharma value chain, and then we have kind of commercialization aspects. That's maybe kind of wonky and a bit nerdy, but what we're really looking at Bayer and at G4A are actual solutions that can help people. You know, so I said that we started with grants for apps. So like when we talk about artificial intelligence, we are looking at things that can kind of organize, aggregate, and interpret all the data that we see and all the data that's available. Part of why we even have a vaccine from a Moderna and a Pfizer is because all of a sudden you have a machine learning algorithm and an AI that can very, very quickly, faster than humans, faster than ever before in the history of mankind, look for drug candidates and drug candidate profiles. This is again on the drug discovery and kind of the clinical development part of the value chain. And so these are, I think, clear examples. And I think in healthcare, this AI conversation, we have to just simplify it because, you know, most people still don't know what drug discovery is, right? I mean, we're still learning collectively as a group. But I always tell people that AI has been around for 30 years, you know, and AI, the clearest example of AI, like everyone flies on an airplane. Do you really think your pilot is flying you? Everyone knows there's autopilot, right? You know, and so we've trusted AI with our lives for literally decades. And I think we're just a lot more aware of it in healthcare right now.
Yeah. I have to say, I don't even trust cruise control in my car.
Right? But you trust it in the sky.
Right. Maybe Tommaso can talk me into it.
I guess it depends which car, right?
Right. Exactly. Maybe not Waymo just yet. But so this is, I mean, I think you brought together two fascinating pieces. Can you talk a little bit about what this means for, as you talked about, you know, just patient outcomes? You know, what is this, what are these new technology innovations mean as we drill down in more sophisticated, and I say sophisticated because it depends on what aspect of the healthcare system you're looking at, but in more sophisticated markets like Europe and the United States, as opposed to maybe other markets in Asia, like in India, where you have a public system and a private system, and for accessibility, not only accessibility to the innovations, whether it's robotics or imaging, but also just from a collaboration and market access perspective. What are your thoughts there on really creating more equilibrium and access across the world?
Dominic, you want to start?
So, I mean, I think, you know, the real part of the solution and part of what's really happening is that businesses, especially in healthcare and technology and digital health, are well in front of governments. It doesn't matter whether it's US or Europe or if you're in India.
Yeah.
And we see this in what I would call market validation. We see this, and you can see this in very public headlines. You know, this year has definitely been kind of a banner year for digital health investment. You see this with the number of mergers. We saw just this week or yesterday, 2 days ago, Amazon is now in the healthcare business officially, you know, with their pharmacy approach. We've seen mergers. I mean, the biggest mergers so far this year have been Teladoc and Livongo, right? $18 billion. And this kind of market validation and this kind of business aspect kind of creates ripples in other countries and other environments. You know, so we have companies at Bayer G4A, you know, that are in India and that we kind of profile as a digital therapeutic companies. That's what a lot of these companies are.
Mhm.
So if you're using a telemedicine or telehealth solution, part of kind of what you're accessing is you are also part of an aggregate system of information. And that information is really being used to go to employers in the US or to governments and say, hey, our technology not only saves lives, but it also saves money. And that's a really kind of a powerful message that you can take to anyone, whether it's an individual or a policymaker, that they can very easily understand and want to support.
Yeah. And Tommaso, how do you think about the introduction of new technology? I mean, I think from a north-south perspective, even though it's not so least in middle income countries or lower and middle income countries to higher income countries, there's been a number of technology innovations, digital innovations as well, just in terms of payments, but also just community health workers using smartphones to diagnose patients and help provide just basic pharmaceutical interventions. How do you see those innovations translating to higher income countries, and maybe vice versa? How do we make the innovations that your teams are coming up with, how do we make them accessible and affordable?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, we are a global company. So Siemens, so we operate everywhere. And our mission is really to serve healthcare as a whole, right? So everybody. And as a result, so we have actually presence on worldwide, and therefore also interact with the regulatory agencies of the respective regions, right? So it's part of what we do. Now, how do we how do we translate the innovation to the market, right? So I mean, this is a complex process that goes on, but we see now with the AI and digitalization that this process actually accelerates. So you see a lot of new technologies deployed using the cloud, which is accessible everywhere and made available through different devices. You also see innovation in hardware, which basically allows to think things a bit differently. Now, all this acceleration is very fascinating and actually drives us because the impact becomes much larger and the reach also larger. And the good thing is that, I mean, I don't know the detail, but we see that the regulators also try to keep the pace while ensuring safety and of the devices that go into the market, right? At least again, from an imaging perspective. So that I know, right? I cannot comment on the rest. So there is this recognition that even in healthcare, the technology is actually accelerating tremendously, following maybe not as fast as the consumer market, but seeing the benefit on the consumer side. People are saying, okay, we should maybe try to find the ways to be able to translate fast the innovation in the healthcare research into product, right? And so it's a very nice momentum that is being created. Also, when you see the regulators that try to find a framework that ensures validation and safety of the devices, but at the same time try to put in place processes that are much faster than the previous one in order to deploy new solutions. And actually, we do see that indirectly by the growth of the number of startups in healthcare that you see around, and actually how fast we manage to have a product in the market compared to what it was before, right? And again, on the imaging side, maybe in the biotech, it's different.
Yeah, I think, you know, since we have a lot of folks outside the healthcare market, I would bring marketplace, I would bring an example to mind. I think, you know, just to take a first world issue, if you've ever broken a bone in the United States, sometimes those hairline fractures are hard to pick up on existing imaging tools. And the expertise of the radiologist or whoever it is that's looking at the x-ray is very critical in figuring out exactly where the fracture is, what nerves may have been impacted. Translating that expertise overseas isn't always so easy. So this is where machine learning, AI, if we can shortcut some of those human learning objectives and kind of move people along more quickly, it could be profound in terms of impact just on daily life, let alone when it comes to cancer treatment or other aspects. So there's been a lot of change in the ecosystem of healthcare globally and otherwise. We've seen unprecedented collaboration in terms of vaccine development with government, but even just across the private sector. Companies of different origination. We've already in record time, incredible record time, have 2 potential vaccines in the United States, and we've been hearing about others in China and Russia. We don't know as much as we'd like to know about all of them, and we're learning, but can you talk where you think the future is for collaboration and what opportunities you see ahead?
Yeah, part of the conversation that we're having at Bayer and where we see the future of, you know, digital health is we're really looking at integrated care solutions, you know, and part of what that means is, and part of what we're talking about, I mentioned earlier, kind of these psychosocial aspects of healthcare. And so for the people that are outside of the healthcare marketplace, when we define health, or if you go to the World Health Organization or Google WHO definition of health, it includes every aspect of your health and well-being, you know, not just if you have a chronic condition or not. And so part of the conversation and how we kind of see this conversation shaping is to where we focus on not patients, because really, like, who really identifies a patient as a patient? Like, even if you have a chronic condition, even if you have asthma or something you've been dealing with as a child or type 1 diabetes, you're not walking around saying, oh, I'm a patient, right? So we are looking at integrated healthcare solutions for people. So what does that mean? This means that people have kind of again, another kind of a value chain, but a value chain for where they are, a kind of a healthcare spectrum. Do they need a healthy living solution? Do they need a kind of a rehab solution? Do they need healthcare coaching? Do they want it? And we're looking at how we as a biopharmaceutical company can get away from selling drugs, for lack of better words, just really giving people solutions that they need to improve their health and wellness.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's the same. So collaboration is fundamental across all the different specialties and people, right? The patients, the physicians, the hospital team, us, the scientists. It's really critical because, like, actually, I echo also Dominic, right? So we are going more and more towards an integrated solution, right? So support, basically, it's support the patient journey during the disease, and it's not only one point, is really the evolution, right? So you really would like to support, basically, to treat the patient down the road to optimize outcome, right? And this is really needs a cooperative approach across all the different entities involved in treating that patient, and that's really fundamental, and that's a very, again, also a very positive and optimistic change that is happening.
Yeah.
The only thing I would kind of layer on with that is the fact that, when we talk about integrated care solutions, I know we have kind of a Cultural Vistas audience, so you'll understand this, is a lot of this is driven by behavioral science. And a lot of that science actually comes out of, at least for us, comes out of Stanford. And there's this book by this guy named BJ Fogg. He wrote a book called Tiny Habits. So again, this brings in the AI element, and we actually partnered with a company at G4A called Sweech, where, they have a cardio kind of an app, and it says, like, let's say you have a 10,000 step meter, or you want to take 10,000 steps a day. So you have this app on your phone, you're on your way home, you're walking, you have 9,000 steps. Sweech will tell you, hey, if you take the long way, if you walk like 2 more blocks, you'll hit your 10,000. Right. And so, like, these kind of behavioral interventions that can improve health, this is kind of a part of integrated care and how people will actually improve their health. Again, around that value chain that I described earlier.
Yeah, that would be great. I definitely walk the extra 2 blocks if I was prompted. So, and I think what I'm hearing from both of you is moving our point of intervention in the continuum of care. If you're thinking about the range and the spectrum, we're moving towards more of the front end, which is prevention, as opposed to getting to people when they've already been sick for some time or are experiencing the effects of a chronic condition or otherwise. And for me, this is most visually just demonstrated, I think, when you think about cancer patients globally. Quite often you can never tell a cancer patient in the US and Europe because they have access to so much treatment, diagnostic testing very early on, typically early on in the progression of the disease. However, if you go to sub-Saharan Africa, you might have patients presenting at the hospital with very large tumors that are larger than perhaps a limb in some scenarios. And it's really just the progression of the disease is so far along that it's hard to imagine a positive outcome at that point, even with the best interventions. So I think, as we move towards that, what is most critical? What do you see coming up the pike in the future that you're most excited about? What are some of the barriers that you see us as a global community moving past to bring some of these ideas and technologies and work that you're doing to life and to realize those positive outcomes for people?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think part of, for people to understand is kind of the why behind the focus on prevention. And I think for the United States and for maybe what I would call the Western world, especially, and now we see this in China and in emerging markets, is the fact that chronic disease, or what we would call in the healthcare space, NCDs, or non-communicable diseases, they're way too expensive to treat.
Yeah.
And when you're in a social healthcare system in a Germany, when you're in Europe or in, other countries where healthcare is a right, these systems simply can't afford to keep pace. And I think you see that especially in demographic trends in Germany. So that's part of the why. I think for the US, this is a really kind of a special why and rationale
Yeah.
for the simple fact that you mentioned cancer. US does great at cancer, the rest of the world, not so much. At the same time, the number one killer worldwide is heart disease. And it's completely preventable. Well, I don't want to say completely, I mean, but it's mostly preventable, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's about exercise, it's about eating a certain way.
Yeah.
Uh, and so that's, again, the rationale. But if you look at heart disease, diabetes, anything cardiometabolic, in the US, even healthy birth weights, is still an issue, more so than in some developed country or underdeveloped countries or less developed countries.
Right.
So, the way we look at it as kind of a digital health ecosystem orchestrator, the real opportunity and what really gets me excited is the fact that, I mean, as always, people can take control. People can be an active participant. I think that's what people have always wanted. People have generally felt jaded with the healthcare system because when they do see their doctor once or twice a year, it's for 8 minutes, they get some pills and they go home and they try to continue on with their life and their outcomes really don't change. And that's really the thing. So what I'm really excited about and part of what I hope for and what gets me excited is health equity, people feeling more in control and really having those outcomes that they want.
Yeah, that's great. I think we've so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move a little bit. Let's move to our audience questions. We had a few that were sent in advance and we have a few coming in, but please do, anyone who's listening, feel free to type your questions into the chat and we're happy to bring them into the conversation. I have a few questions here that were sent to us in advance, and I think our conversation has been to a large extent influenced by some of these things, but that have been brought up by our listeners. And so I just want to kind of touch upon some of the specific questions that we maybe haven't addressed specifically. So we have one question that came in from a participant, and I'd love to just hear your thoughts on this. So why didn't AI prepare us for the current pandemic? Is that a capability? Is that something that we're working towards? Where are we on intelligence?
I would love to start by answering that. I said I did global communications and I did global communications for the Bayer animal health business. And part of what I learned in that role is that part of why we didn't see this, so what we're dealing with, especially with COVID, it's a zoonotic disease. So a disease that transfers between animals and humans and like back and forth.
Yeah.
And veterinarians have been talking about zoonotic disease transfer for like 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
They've been trying to partner with their physician partners saying, hey, pay attention to this. And we probably have some medical doctors, but the physicians have been like, go treat a giraffe or a horse, like don't bother me, but veterinarians are extremely clever. Most have been trained on many different species and they have an ecosystem view or what they call One Health. So they look at disease in an ecosystem and transfer between humans and animals.
Right.
And this element for public health systems has been missing. And part of what has really been missing, there's not a government on this planet or a health system on this planet that does disease surveillance very well. No one really has a disease surveillance system. The closest thing that we have to it now is if you have a Corona app on your phone, right? A COVID tracing app. And that's voluntary, right? So because no one wants to feel like the government is in their space and telling them what to do. And so disease surveillance is something that's never been invested in. It's something that's never been scalable. And it's something that we're really just coming across. And so it's really difficult to put AI, or this would probably be machine learning because there's a difference between true AI and machine learning. It's really difficult to put machine learning on a data set that simply does not exist.
Right. Yeah. So as we kind of think about the flip side of collaboration, which is, I think, where the world has been moving in some extent the last few years, we think about protectionism and isolationism. And hopefully we can move beyond that. But in 4 years' time, we might have a different leader in the United States. We might have different leaders in other parts of the world. What do you see as the biggest impacts of protectionism and isolationism in terms of digital health?
Go ahead. I'm on the research side and on the development, right? So I cannot really comment on all the aspects of what will impact, but actually what we are seeing is in practice, the contrary. So where there is more and more cross collaborations between hospitals all over the world, and actually COVID even made this more extreme because it's become pandemic. So let's get all together to fix the problem, right? So from a scientific and development perspective, actually, I see that growing more collaborations to actually fix healthcare overall, because it's actually a global problem. Now the impact more at the country levels, I cannot really comment, but I'm optimistic that actually collaboration will still continue to thrive.
Love that. I love the optimism. So, and then, you know, I think this kind of fits into a lot of what we've been seeing now, and it's trust in good information sources and scientists. And the scientists the ones who are really kind of serving as our primary communication channel, or is it politicians? And so what do you think has been the primary impact of those messengers and, you know, calling, you know, different information fake news or trust in public discourse and information?
We could spend the next hour on that topic. I mean, I think, you know, part of what we have to, again, I live in Germany and I live in a country, and I'm from Washington, D.C., as you mentioned, but I live in a country that has been taught that it's healthy to question authority. I believe that. And I also live in a country that believes in science.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think part of what we see now is we, especially in the US and from a US perspective, this is the most polarized potentially that the US has ever been. I think this is not something just from 2020. This has been a development from maybe the past 20, 30 years. You know, if we think about the last time people actually reached across the aisles, this was actually in The Economist, in an Economist article, maybe a year or 18 months ago. You know, they showed this really great kind of infographic in terms of how people worked across the aisles, you know, between the Republicans and the Democrats. And over the last 20, 30 years especially, I mean, it's a lot more blue on one side and a lot more red on one side. I think the net, you know, of this, and, you know, I think all what we can hope for is we've seen the political spectrum in the United States over the last 8 to 12 years especially extend. So it's longer, I think, on both sides. So you have extremists on the right, or what's becoming a more extreme right, and I think even a more, I don't want to, personally, I wouldn't want to use the word extreme, but a more extreme left. And, you know, this kind of widening political spectrum in the US is very new. I hope, and part of the real solution to it is really education. You know, I look back at the second Bush and No Child Left Behind, and I think there's a huge kind of discrepancy. If you were to, I'm sure you could do some sort of regression analysis to see what taking certain critical thinking elements out of school and teaching tests did to actual processing of knowledge and information. Yeah. That's my hypothesis, and that's kind of my thesis, I think, on the scale of science and politics.
Right. Tommaso, any comments there?
I'm a scientific, always double check your sources. That's our golden truth. That's how we have been raised.
Right.
No matter what. And it's healthy, right? So in science, you always double check whatever the sources, the experiment, the data, question it. And so basically that's, you can apply the same concept to anything.
Yeah. What is it? The standard in healthcare advocacy is always get a second opinion.
Exactly.
So we've got a few other questions. I think we've touched on some of these. I'm going to try and combine our last question in here, but there are some questions about the environmental benefits as it relates to healthcare that some of these digital innovations bring, along with machine learning and AI. I think, Dominic, you talked about the zoonotics piece of things, but there's an environmental component to that as well. And are there any sort of insights that you would bring to that as well as to the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, for us, when we talk about the environment, normally that's around sustainability, and I mean, I think for us, what AI enables us to do is become, going back to, I guess, the original topic, is to become more aware of our data. So at Bayer, we do, and actually many countries in the EU, Siemens as a German company also, we have a goal to be carbon neutral, and so I think that's a pretty important goal. This is something that even the Gates Foundation has been talking about for the last 20 years. Your carbon footprint. Bill Gates has always said, don't tax me on my income, tax me on my output, right? And so these kinds of topics, I think, are a lot more relevant. I think that most companies, especially in the public market, know that they have to do more to be a responsible kind of a citizen, especially when you're a multinational. So AI pretty much helps us, gives us that data layer to actually say that we achieve those targets.
Yeah. And then to look at the impacts as well and the specific outcomes that they have in the health sector. Yeah. So I think we probably have time for one more question. And I'm gonna read this specifically, but then I'll ask you to expand upon it. Where do you see the biggest opportunities to scale digital healthcare delivery in less developed and lower resourced countries or communities? And I would add to that in saying in terms of more advanced healthcare markets as well. I mean, if we could kind of maybe globetrot around the world, what you think are the biggest opportunities and what gives you hope and optimism for your work every day?
That every people get the same level of care anywhere. Standardization and access. This is what the opportunity lies ahead worldwide.
Yeah. How far away are we from that, Tommaso?
I'm optimistic, so I hope close, right? So we'll see. But for sure, I think this is a trend and this is what we are driven for and what we are pushing for. Then you cannot predict the future, but at least we are doing our best to make it.
Yeah. Is there one specific innovation that you think is leading the edge in terms of opportunities?
It's difficult to pick one, right? There are so many things that are happening that basically that can impact any disease, from prevention to treatment.
Yeah.
Dominic, you wanted to say something? Oh, sorry.
Top three, I'm going to push you a little bit. Top three. Couple of examples.
I need to think about it, but
Okay.
it's a lot.
All right, we'll come back to you.
We discussed cardio, onco, all these prevention, treatment, right? So if somebody has if you take even the example of cancer, right? So can we actually devise method to detect earlier and also pick the right therapy for that patient, right? Which one, which is the best one instead of doing trial and error or even just trying the default, right? Can you actually support the best decision, for that specific patient based on the wealth of knowledge that is available worldwide? So basically all these automation, like I said, through AI and also decision support made accessible across the board will actually hopefully help better treating cancer, for instance.
Dominic?
Yeah, there's not a lot I can add. I mean, for me, it gets back to the original point, or one of the original points. All healthcare is local. And it's really difficult to deliver healthcare in a scalable way or to look at it even on a global level. And you know this from your experience, Rekha, because it always comes back to a local solution oftentimes it's a local kind of a problem. And in the US, you have like Cancer Alley, right? You have these Superfund sites, people that express disease and cancer, a certain way, in a disproportionate way than the rest of the United States. And so part of it is really, it gets back to public health. I think Tommaso was really talking about equity and access. I think healthcare really comes down to values. And when people look at it, it always comes down to money, right? Who pays for what?
Yeah.
And depending on the country, that kind of sets the value system. And that determines who pays for what,
Yeah.
when they pay, and how they pay. And until we have healthier populations, we really can't pay any less. Because insurance, no matter if you're in a big social system or if you're in a more private market like the US, it's all based on the concept of risk pooling, right? So if I have a healthier population, I can charge less. So again, it gets back to prevention. That's part of how you get to access. There have to be several moving pieces at the same time, I think, to have any kind of a real impact.
Yeah. I think we can all extrapolate from that in terms of if we had prevented some early travel, how we might have been able to maybe kind of prevent COVID from taking over globally and extending for as long as it has. I think even the novices among us can do that and weigh those questions. Okay, so one final note of optimism. I think we're all at the end of a long year and looking for those points of hope. Where do you get your energy from, and where do you get your most hope for health and where we're moving?
I don't know about Tommaso, but he mentioned his interns. Two groups, the interns, I love having that new energy in our company. And then really the entrepreneurs we work with, that energy is infectious. Even if we're not working with them directly, I hear from entrepreneurs and pitches every single day. And just someone that's so excited about their business or their solution or how they help people makes me want to help them and help people. And that's what I'm really excited about.
Great.
And I would echo, so basically the team, the passion, the drive, and also I guess the goal of helping people live a healthier life, right, longer.
Right.
So basically that's what's driving us.
Right. You're both absolutely on message for Cultural Vistas. I want to thank you for your time today. I think this was a rich and very inspiring conversation, and hopefully it will help drive some of our continued learning in the space as we learn to be good citizens in a time of COVID. And I just have a few reminders for our audience today. I want to thank you, first of all, for all your wonderful questions and your interest and vigilance and sticking with us. And hopefully you've had your lunch if you're in the United States, and your dinner if you're in other parts of the world. But thank you for your time, and we hope you'll join us for our upcoming discussions. We hope to keep the series moving at a regular pace. But you can join Cultural Vistas staff for a book club discussion of Fareed Zakaria's new book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, on December 2nd at 9 a.m. Pacific and 12 p.m. Eastern and 6 p.m. Central European Standard Time. Registration details will be provided in a follow-up email along with a link to view Mr. Zakaria's inspirational keynote from the 2020 Cultural Vistas Awards benefit. And if I know this community as I'm learning, it will be a very rich and robust conversation. So I hope you'll put that in your calendars and join that discussion, as well as any future New Vistas conversations we put forward. But please do send staff your ideas, and we're happy for all of your participation. And as we approach the holiday season, we wish you all joy and peace and safety. Please wear your masks. I'm sure this is an audience that's preaching to the choir, but we wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tommaso.
everyone.
Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
Likewise.